Hello and welcome back to Relentless Learning. So this video is going to be a little bit different. Jordan Peterson came out with a video, actually very interestingly called DIE, Diversity, Inclusion, Equity Must Die. So DIE must die. So we're going to be going through parts of it and just going to be analyzing bits and pieces, asking some questions. So let's get to it.
First, my qualified and supremely trained heterosexual white male grad students, and I've had many others, by the way, are no longer eligible upon graduation for university research positions, despite stellar scientific dossiers. This is partly because of diversity, inclusivity, and equity mandates. My preferred acronym, DIE.
So Peterson talks about students not getting hired because of DIE mandates. So that's a pretty big claim. First question I have is, do we have that transparency? Are we able to see, why some students weren't hired, why they were hired? What are the kind of stats in that regard? Because realize it's not always about GPA. I know he mentions merit and stuff like that. I'm also wondering, like, volunteer experience. Is there an interview? Are they looking at the person in like a more holistic fashion as opposed to just like these are their marks on paper?
All my craven colleagues must craft DIE statements to obtain a research grant. They all lie, excepting the minority of true believers, and they teach their students to do the same. And they do it constantly with various rationalizations and justifications, further corrupting what is already a stunningly corrupt enterprise.
So this part was a little scary to consider that you have these equity blurbs that people are faking for the sake of grants and then perpetuating that and teaching that to their students. For me personally, equity is something intrinsic. Like I want people to have more opportunities, and I want spaces to be diversified. So it's one thing if you think policies are kind of wishy-washy, this comes in, then this next year, a new fad comes in, that's a little bit of different. But when you think about equity in terms of what it actually is, and giving people opportunities, I find that a little bit hard to believe that someone wouldn't necessarily want that, right? Because I can have an opportunity and, that person having an opportunity doesn't take away from me and what I bring to the table, Now, obviously, if institutions are leaning a little bit too much in one direction, that becomes problematic because I feel like that does push people to, fake it till you make it, but in a very negative way. Like, I'm just going to lie on paper for the sake of this outcome. And I think that is more of an institution problem or challenge. I don't work for U of T, so I don't know what Peterson went through, but I will acknowledge that in all organizations, we have to see that it's not indoctrination, but we're actually genuinely authentic, trying to get people to jump on board as opposed to like finger wagging and being like, if you don't do this, you're problematic. Now the question becomes, how do we authentically get people on board, right? Easier said than done. That's the $1 million question. I do think it is important that we don't have too much hand holding, especially when it comes to certain topics related to race, right? We need to get more comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. It is okay to be uncomfortable, but at the same time, we don't want to necessarily come off as being too aggressive, because then that's going to be off-putting. So I really feel like this fine balance between not hand-holding, but also being like, we need to have a little change right now. It can't be lazy.
Some of my colleagues even allow themselves to undergo so-called anti-bias training conducted by supremely unqualified human resources personnel, lecturing inanely and blithely and in an accusatory manner about theoretically all-pervasive racist, sexist, heterosexist attitudes. Such training is now often a precondition to occupy a faculty position on a hiring committee.
Now, are anti-bias trainings completely 100% foolproof? Is it totally found in science? No, there's definitely a little bit of pseudoscience in there. So I concur with Peterson. The way that I think about it is, one, is it going to kill you to do it? No. Do you have the potential for learning maybe something about yourself or others that you didn't know? Yes, right? Does it potentially provide you a point for more self-reflection, something you didn't know? Yes. So I'm kind of the mindset, why not, right? Especially if there's the potential for improving yourself, right? Because under the pretense, if you know better, do better, how are we going to be able to do better if we're not willing to take that step of let me try and learn. Let me try to see if there's something for me, right? We have to be a little bit more open-minded, I argue, to be able to develop ourselves, professionally and on a personal level. Now, around the 4-minute 44-second mark, he does mention that we can't change people's internal implicit biases with something like anti-bias training. I actually agree with that. But the thing is that we have to consider if there's something about ourselves, our way of thinking that we discover through something like anti-bias training, then I would say the onus goes onto the person to actually ask yourself, how can I further myself? How can I maybe connect with members of the community? How can I develop professionally and personally to be able to move on from this potential bias that I may have, right? I would hope that no one is making the claim that you do this anti-bias training and then suddenly you have no biases anymore. So I think it's very important to make that distinction.
We all still suffer under the dye yoke, with its baleful effect on what was once the closest we had ever come to truly meritorious selection. Furthermore, the accrediting board for grad clinical psych training programs in Canada are now planning to refuse to accredit university clinical programs unless they have a social justice orientation. That, combined with some recent legislative changes in Canada, claiming to outlaw so-called conversion therapy, but really making it exceedingly risky for clinicians to do anything ever but agree always and about everything with their clients, have likely doomed the practice of clinical psychology.
So then Peterson talks about this true meritorious selection. Now, I wasn't sure if by objective testing he meant standardized testing, because if that's the case, standardized testing, there's lots of research that when it's used in isolation on its own as kind of like an entry point into something, there is a lot of challenges with that. And I will list just some of the resources in terms of how standardized testing in and of itself can be a gatekeeper. He mentions, and I quote, professionals are terrified of their now woke governing professional colleges because of this social justice orientation. Now, this is a huge double arm paintbrush because one, you're saying that, all pharmacists, doctors, nurses are against social justice orientations and the like, which I think is very, very strong. And two, I feel like it's fear mongering. For sure, we ask ourselves, does the government make questionable decisions? For sure, most definitely. But to turn around and say that professionals are terrified, I think that's too big of a statement. Now, I could understand with certain things that are going on in the USA in terms of, abortion and jail time and all that stuff, that might be a little bit different. But in the context of equity, I still think it's too big of a jump.
Just exactly what am I supposed to do when I meet a grad student or young professor hired on dye grounds? Manifest instant skepticism regarding their professional ability? What a slap in the face to a truly meritorious outsider. And perhaps that's the point.
So this part for me was a little bit confusing because he mentions, we shouldn't discredit someone who's been hired on DIE grounds. But I feel like that's kind of the whole insinuation of the video, right? That he calls at one point, both in the video and the article, BIPOC are utterly unqualified. Now, do people know whether they've been hired based on DIE? Is that something that they walk around saying, I've been hired because of this exclusively? Is the assumption that BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color, don't have any merit and they're only being hired because of their skin color? Because obviously that is definitely problematic.
In 2020, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the Oscar people, embarked on a 5-year plan, does that ring any historical bells, to, quote, diversify our organization and expand our definition of the best. They did so in an attempt which included developing, quote, new representation and inclusion standards for Oscars to, hypothetically, quote, better reflect the diversity of the movie-going audience.
So what's wrong with that? Right? You can check out my previous video for looking at how I define DIE, but at the end of the day, having different bodies at the decision-making table are going to yield different results. Now, think about yourself. How many of you were excited when Black Panther came out, or when Shang-Chi came out, or even like animated movies like Encanto, Coco, Moana? Also, just seeing people play the roles that are attributed in movies. So seeing an indigenous person play an indigenous role in a movie, I don't understand how that could be a bad thing, right? At the end of the day, it's just going to get more people invested because they see more representation of themselves. And at the end of the day, I don't see it being problematic unless someone actually does have implicit bias, like, certain members of this community are not good at acting or they're not attractive, because then that is a problem, right? And I feel like that's what this whole movement has been about, to try to tease some of those implicit biases out.
We are now at the point where race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual preference is first accepted as the fundamental characteristic defining each person, just as the radical leftists were hoping, and second, is now treated as the most important qualification for study, research, and employment.
So there's so many things here. First, I'm personally put off when we start using words like radical and when we start attributing left and right, because the first thing that comes to mind is if someone says this is very far left, someone sees themselves as being on the right side. Are they listening to the argument of the left, or are they automatically just tuned out because they're like, oh, it's left, I don't agree with it? Vice versa too, right? If someone's more on the left side and then someone from the right is speaking, they're like, oh no, that's too conservative, I don't agree. So I feel like putting in terminology like that is very divisive. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but let's kind of throw that out of the door for a moment and just look at what has been said. How we choose to identify by its very nature is personal, right? So if I choose to walk around and identify by my nationality, for example, I am Canadian or I am American or I am this, that is my choice. If I choose to do it by my ethnicity, also my choice.
How can accusing your employees of racism, etc., sufficient to require retraining, particularly in relationship to those who are working in good faith to overcome whatever bias they might still, in these modern liberal times, manifest, be anything other than insulting, annoying, invasive, high-handed, moralizing, inappropriate, ill-considered, counterproductive?
So listen, no one said that this personal work, this self-reflection is easy. No one says it's comfortable. And as I mentioned already, we need to get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. It's not a bad thing, right? You go through some little rough patches, you learn from it, you grow, done. That's it.
When does the left go too far? When they worship at the altar of die and insist that the rest of us, who mostly want to be left alone, do so as well.
Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about and finish off with this quote is that Peterson says, he insists that the rest of us who mostly want to be left alone. I want to focus on this because when you look at anti-bias training, when you look at anti-racism training, when you look at all those movements, the people that want to be left alone, I would probably argue are the ones that need to be brought in the most, right? So the fact that he's saying leave me alone, I want nothing to do with this, I would kind of turn around and be like, no, come friend, let's talk about this a little bit more. Anyways, thank you for watching. This has been a response video to Peterson's DIE Must Die. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you.